Y buenos días a todos los aquí presentes. Yo soy Andrea Bernal, soy periodista y estoy muy complacida de estar aquí con todos ustedes. Y muchísimas gracias a la Fundación de Desarrollo e Innovación por la invitación y es para mí un privilegio presentar el libro de Ian Bremmer, El poder de la crisis, en español y en este contexto de la Feria del Libro en Bogotá. Es el politólogo más importante de Estados Unidos, que se estará conversando con el presidente Iván Duque de Colombia y esta conversación será una inspiración y muy interesante y nos van a ayudar a entender por qué la historia dice que necesitamos una crisis. Como bien dice usted, señor Bremmer, es un placer tenerlo entre nosotros. Bienvenido, presidente Duque. Tienen ustedes la palabra.
Andrea, thank you so much for your kind introduction. And it's always a pleasure to be with Ian Bremmer, a dear friend, one of the most respected academics in the world, but also an innovator, a person who has devoted all his academic life, but also his professional life, to understanding and explaining the world, the trends, and the patterns that will change our lives. Ian, it's also great to have you with the Colombian audience and launching and presenting your book within the framework of the Bogota Book Fair, in Spanish called El Poder de la Crisis, The Power of Crisis. So without further introduction, I really want to begin by asking you something. Why the name, The Power of Crisis? What did you mean when you thought about the title of the book? Because in some sort of way, it lets us know that there are crises that have to be embraced. And Winston Churchill used to say, never miss the opportunity of a crisis. So Ian, thank you for being with us this morning. Thank you for this amazing book. And welcome again to Colombia today virtually, but we hope to have you in person quite soon.
Thank you, Iván. It's wonderful to be here with both you and Andrea, and to have a chance to talk to an audience in Colombia. I wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't for you, as both a close friend, but also someone I have a great deal of respect for. So I'm delighted that this is a way to kick off. And why the power of crisis? Well, we know that the global order today is rather unhealthy. It's rather unstable, and we face all of these conflicts, global challenges in terms of disruptive technologies, the pandemic we just got through, climate change, also major wars around the world, in the Middle East, in Europe, and politically in my country, frankly, in Brazil. And you can look at that and you can say, oh my God, the world is in such a horrible shape and I want to blame my political leaders. But in reality, the reason for the challenges that we are in geopolitically is not because of Trump or Biden or even Putin or Xi Jinping. It's much more deep and structural. It's been coming for decades. And when you have challenges that come for decades, when you have challenges that are about the institutional framework not being aligned with the balance of power, the way you fix that is with a crisis. The way you fix that is because something hits you in the face hard enough that you pay attention. It's not like, okay, I need to go to the gym, and you never go because you're busy. It's suddenly, you've gotten unwell, you have a heart attack, you go in to see the doctor, and the doctor says you've got to change your life, and then you change your life. And that's what we're facing globally right now. So I'm not trying to underestimate the nature of the challenges in the world today, but I am saying that the seeds of a more functional new global order are not to be found in the elections. They're not to be found in the left or the right. They're to be found in the crises that are shaking the global order enough so that we can respond effectively. And what I want to do in this book, and I want to do with you and more broadly, is try to analyze some of these crises and see where the opportunities really are, and are we taking advantage of the crises in front of us, or are we letting them go to waste? I think that's the essential question of whether our world will turn towards peace, or whether we are in a, as many leaders are now saying, almost apocalyptically, that we're in a pre-war period right now.
So if we take those elements that you just described, you have picked in the book some crises to shape the discussion and the conversation. And you talk about the crisis between the US and China. You have an amazing chapter on the climate crisis, but you also touch upon disruptive technologies and also the post-pandemic lessons and the concept of G0, which I will ask you later on. But you've picked those. And also in the in Spanish edition epilogue, you have a chapter on Ukraine and Russia. But which are those crises that you believe we should welcome, and why have you picked those as the way to craft the message and let people be aware of the importance of this crisis in order first to avoid or maybe to prevent some of the conflicts that some people have thought inevitable, but also how do you think this crisis will allow us to do much better in the upcoming decades?
Well, I'll tell you, the one that we really shouldn't welcome was the pandemic. And here I say that because we've gotten through it. You know, it's in the rearview mirror. We're living normally. We've got some new technologies, so we're doing this video conference today that we wouldn't have done if the pandemic hadn't hit. That's a useful thing. But the reality is that the world is not more capable of responding to a pandemic. And certainly we don't have stronger global institutions. In fact, I would argue our institutions are weaker. And the reason for that, and it's very sad, is that the pandemic was not a big enough crisis for anyone to really care. And it wasn't big enough in a few ways. First, the fact that we were so effective in having technologies that would allow us to make vaccines so that we could get back to normal pretty quickly. That was a wonderful thing for humanity, but a problematic thing in using that crisis to build stronger, more resilient global understanding of early warning and response mechanisms. Secondly, you'll remember, you know, the United States was blaming China for the initial days of the virus. The Chinese were lying to the rest of the world and their own people. They refused to actually talk about the month where you had human-to-human transmission. And then the Americans announced they were leaving the World Health Organization in the middle of the pandemic. I mean, it couldn't be worse. And then I look at my own country today, and the opposition to the CDC, the fake news, the disinformation. So unfortunately, we did not learn lessons from the pandemic. We didn't. There was no power in that crisis. It was too small, and it didn't force us to do anything. But when I look at climate change, or I look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or I look at the beginnings of disruptive technologies, particularly AI, I see crises that are much bigger, and I see crises that we already see creating true action, different action than we otherwise would have expected. Governance and new values and resources being deployed at scale radically differently than they would have ever happened if we hadn't experienced those crises. We see that with the strength of NATO and of Europe's defense conversations. We see it with the immense amount of money being spent in transition energy, and in China leading the world in a post-carbon energy environment, and everyone else trying to catch up. And I think we're starting to see it as well in the prioritization of governance efforts around AI. We can get into and talk about all of these, but I am more hopeful about all of these other crises than I am about the one that we just got through.
Ian, I want to connect that sentiment about the crisis that was triggered by COVID itself, but also there's an amazing chapter in the book where you make the reflection about the US and China. And I was president at the time where we faced the pandemic, and I remember that we had a tremendous support from the United States in order to donate massively vaccines for a country like Colombia. But there was a moment where we also had to be very close in our conversation with the Chinese government in order to have access to the Sinovac vaccines, which came more rapidly to Latin America. And I can tell you that I really had the sentiment that both countries gave us a very important support at the time. And when I think about the discussion of the possibility of an unavoidable conflict between the US and China, for me, it's kind of scary and sometimes absurd. And I think you point out in the book how there's a level of interdependence. And you actually say that when you look at the bipolar world that we saw in the 80s and maybe a little bit of the early 90s, where there was US and Russia, they never had the interdependency that US and China have today. And I like that you mentioned in the book that we should make that assumption of a conflict, that it will be unavoidable, to really prevent that to occur and to look deeply at the power of having them both working together, according also with the definition of the main differences that they have. So why don't you expand a little bit on that and tell us, okay, what lessons can we get, and why not allowing that conflict to erupt, as some people are trying to predict, is so important for the world? And let me also mention something: the interdependence in terms of economic terms, and also giving an example, China being the largest owner of US Treasury bills as a country. So let's elaborate on that.
You're absolutely right, Iván. It is the reality. We can talk, you've seen people talk about a Cold War between the US and China. You've even heard people talk about the inevitability of war between the US and China. But I mean, the reality is, when you look around the world, nobody wants that Cold War. Outside the US and China, look at any country, look at Colombia, look at the Europeans, look at Southeast Asia. All of those countries want to have relations that are more stable with both the United States and China. They don't want to pick a side. Look at the banks, look at the corporations in my own country, in the United States, in China. The vast majority of these powerful organizations don't want a Cold War. They don't want to pick a side. And I think that it's very hard to fight a Cold War if a few leaders in Washington and Beijing are the only ones that want it. And so that interdependence is extremely important. But Iván, you and I also see that there is a big conversation, a nationalism and a populism and more industrial policy that is causing people to talk about decoupling of the two economies. The Chinese have not allowed US companies like Facebook and Twitter and Google to operate inside China. The Americans are now passing legislation that will force ByteDance to sell TikTok, or it'll be shut down. You see this talk about de-risking, but in the reality is about making each country less interdependent on the other. And I'll tell you two things: one negative, one positive. The negative one is that when I look at Taiwan, I see a country that right now is incredibly important for the United States and for China, because they produce a massive amount of semiconductors that are essential to both countries' economies in the future. Now, the Americans want to build more semiconductors in the US, and that's understandable. They're trying to build, their own high-tech workforce and their own entrepreneurship. But they're also putting export controls on semiconductors so that the Chinese won't be able to get them from Taiwan. So the Chinese are going to build their own. Well, what's happening here, Iván, is that Taiwan is now becoming, over time, much less important for the US, much less important for China, much less interdependence over Taiwan, which means the likelihood of a fight over Taiwan in 10 years is much higher than it is today. And we should worry whenever we see relations where the interdependence is being actively undermined and thrown away. I mean, the US and China are like parents with children, and maybe the love has lost the relationship, but they still care about the kids. They love the kids and they want to make sure the kids can grow up well. And as long as that is true, responsible parents will continue to find a way to be decent with each other, to engage with each other. If the kids are out of the house and no longer matter as much, you're not responsible for them, suddenly the parents can go crazy, right? That's what we worry about. So that's the bad news. The good news, and it really is good news, Ivan, is that when I think about the future of the global economy and globalization, I see the Chinese becoming dominant in transition energy. The money they have spent in supply chains and critical minerals and in batteries and electric cars and solar and wind and nuclear. And the Americans and the Europeans are looking at that. They're trying to catch up. But the Chinese have a huge lead at scale, at scale. And then I see the United States leading the world in artificial intelligence. And the key companies in Silicon Valley are becoming the monopoly platforms that everyone has to work with on AI. And it's a massively important transformative technology that no one else can catch up with. Now, why am I saying that? Because I see right now in the United States a legislative effort to make sure that Chinese EVs don't make it in the US. And if the Americans want to punish their own consumers and they want to make sure that American consumers have lousy EVs that are expensive and don't work very well, the United States can do that. But the rest of the world is going to be working with China on transition energy. And that is globalization. It's not going away. Now, Ivan, if the Chinese want to regulate AI and make sure that their own people don't have access to the best AI in the world because they're scared that it's going to undermine the Communist Party, they can do that. And they can make their own population less productive and less efficient, maybe even less smart. But the rest of the world is going to work with the United States and these AI companies. Everybody else is going to do it. And that's globalization. And so what I see is that even though you have some forces in the world's two largest economies that are talking about decoupling and talking about Cold War, the world is much more multipolar, the world is much more complex, and globalization will not be stopped by those small numbers of actors. So ultimately, just like you as president of Colombia, I am very optimistic that the world will still continue to work together on these issues.
So I think that's a very not only inspiring but optimistic view, which I likely share. But I want to connect that reflection with something that you mentioned in the book, and it's about the concept of G0, where I also want you to maybe tell the people that are following us this morning and that are going to read the book. The concept of G0 is it's a concept that you put it in the framework, in the framework of what happened during the pandemic, and also in some sort of way how we couldn't respond in a certain way to many of the challenges because there wasn't enough coordination. There was more selfishness than thinking in a broader global way. So you finish by saying, okay, we're optimistic, we should look at this, but if we put the concept of G0 and the lessons from the pandemic, don't you think that in some way is a very important risk?
I do. And that's why we're seeing more crises. So the opportunity comes from the crises, but the underlying reality is this G0 geopolitical environment. And why has that happened? The G0 is the opposite of the G7 and G20. We have these, big organizations where all of the world leaders come together, but in reality, they're focused just on their own populations. They're focused on nationalism, and they're not focusing on global governance and global responses to global challenges. Now, I would argue that the reason that's happened, you come out of World War II and the United States wins, and it creates all of these global institutions that align with the US and its allies, its friends, its values. That's how you get the United Nations. It's how you get the Bretton Woods institutions like, you know, the WTO and the World Bank and the IMF. But over time, the balance of power changes and the institutions are sticky. They don't shift. So today we have a Security Council with, you know, a war criminal that has a veto. But the Japanese and the Germans don't have a permanent seat. Why not? Well, because the balance of power changed, but we didn't adapt the institutions. So you can see, you know, where the crisis comes from. Now, there are three reasons that we have this G0 world, three big reasons. The first reason is because when the Soviet Union collapsed, we didn't integrate Russia into the West. Now, you can blame Putin, you can blame the oligarchs, you can blame the West, but it didn't happen. And today, Russia is in decline. They are very angry, and they blame the United States and the West. So that's one reason. A second reason is that we did bring China into global institutions. We integrated the Chinese into the global economy. And the assumption was that as they got wealthier, they would become much more Western, that they would reform their political and economic institutions to become more like the free market, more like the democracy. And they have become much wealthier. They're a middle-income economy. They're the second largest economy in the world. They're the biggest creditor to the developing world, but they are not more like the West. They are still state capitalist. The state controls the economy. They're still authoritarian. And in fact, in many ways, under Xi Jinping in the last 10 years, they've become more so. And the Americans and the West is not comfortable with that, not happy about that, for we just discussed. And then the last reason is that while those first two things have happened, you've had tens and tens of millions of people in democracies that increasingly feel like their own leaders, their own governments do not represent them, that their own democracies are not legitimate. That's a particular problem in my own country, in the United States, where the only thing that Americans agree on politically is that the other side is trying to destroy democracy. It's the only thing they agree on. All the Biden supporters think that the Trump supporters want to destroy American democracy. All the Trump supporters believe that the Biden supporters are trying to destroy democracy. And you know, you put those three structural factors together and you get a G0. And how do you get out of the G0? You need crises. The crises are what will make you reform the institutions and create new institutions that over the last 30, 40 years, you didn't think you needed to do. You refused to do. It was too easy. You kicked the can. So I'll give you an example. Russia's war in Ukraine now is in its 11th year. 11th year. They invaded in 2014. They illegally annexed Crimea without a shot, and then they sent their troops, denying it, into southeast Ukraine, the little green men, right? You and I remember this. That was not a big enough crisis. No one did anything. Minimal sanctions. Nobody punished the Russians. Nobody spent any more money on NATO, on defense. You know, the Germans opened Nord Stream 2. It wasn't a big enough crisis to drive action. And so Putin in 2022 looks at that and says, yeah, look, they don't care. They're not going to do anything. So I can go and invade all of Ukraine. And what did NATO do? The first response was, we'll get Zelensky out. You know, and if Zelensky had been a little bit less courageous, if his character was closer to the character of Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan, who took the plane out, as opposed to went and stayed and tried to defend his country, then Ukraine would have fallen. So the crisis wasn't big enough. And now we've got a bigger crisis. And that bigger crisis is forcing the Europeans to act, and it's forcing President Macron to suddenly say, hey, Europe is mortal. Europe might die. He said this yesterday. We've got to really take care of our own defense. We can't count on the Americans. They care about themselves. They care about the Chinese. Where was Macron saying that in 2017, 2018, 2020? You and I know he was nowhere. He was nowhere. Because it needed a bigger crisis. That's what my book is about.
So, Ian, I mean, this is so fascinating, and I just love the way that that you put the debate in the size of the crisis, the reaction to the crisis, and the governance to face a crisis. And you have an amazing chapter on the climate crisis. So let me try to put this question. Do you think we as maybe the international community is going to be able to deal with the challenges that we will see derived from the climate crisis with the governance structures that we have today? And let me also put a more maybe precise element. I have the sensation that many of the solutions to the climate crisis have been global north driven, global north created, but I think the global south in some sort of way has been left aside in order to be really part of the solution. And most importantly, the hotspots like the Amazon basin or the Congo basin, these elements that are definitive in order to reach nature positive solutions have been left out from the real debate of mobilizing massive resources. How do you think that the crisis should be approached in a clever, fast, and effective way, and not as a club of the global north, big countries trying to patronize the global south in how to face, solve, and govern this crisis?
Look, I mean, I think that the solutions to climate change, which have come too late, right? It's kind of like just like the Russia situation. We had decades of climate change, and we had very powerful corporations that did everything they could to obfuscate and lie and obscure and use their power to stop us from addressing a growing climate challenge when it would have been a lot easier to do. But as the challenge got bigger, as it became more global, as young people started getting angrier, it became a crise de coeur. And suddenly you started seeing real changes in the power structure to respond to climate. Now, I wouldn't say the government started it. I would say that the banks started it. I looked at the financial institutions, and especially those that were handling pensions for 10 years, longer time horizon, realizing that investments in thermal coal were going to be worthless because there was going to be massive regulation against it, and there was going to be massive outrage against it. So they stopped investing, and they started putting a huge amount of money in new technologies. And some of that was first transition in fossils, like natural gas and LNG. And then, of course, you started moving into new technologies. And as that grew at scale, then you'd see that solar and wind and increasingly geothermal and nuclear at scale are becoming cheaper than coal, and over time are becoming cheaper than oil. And so, look, it's hard to say that climate is something that you're optimistic about as we continue to see the world's oceans get warmer, surface temperature, and we see biodiversity die off, and all of these things that you and I are very concerned about. And yet I am an optimist about climate, because I fully believe that in the next 30 years, we will have a world where the majority of the power of the energy comes from post-carbon sources that are abundant, that are decentralized, and that are cheap. And that means that our grandkids are going to have experiences that no one else in the world has ever had. I mean, they're going to have global power that is sustainable and available to everyone. Now, who's driving that? Is the North driving that? You could say the North started driving it, but I see China driving it. I don't see the global North driving it. I see the Chinese doing everything they can to ensure that they become dominant in post-carbon global energy. And I'm glad they're doing it. I'd rather it was the United States and America's friends, but if the US isn't going to do it, someone has to do it. And by the way, China today is the largest emitter of carbon on the planet. And not only overall, but even per capita, they now emit more carbon than the wealthier Europeans. So, I mean, they need this technology and they need to export it. And the fact that the Americans and Europeans are spending more time figuring out how they can support their own industries as opposed to how they can take advantage of getting as many transition vehicles into the economy as fast as possible shows that the priorities of the West are fundamentally misplaced. That's what it shows.
Well, that's, listening to you, I have more and more questions, but I also want to get into another chapter that you have in the book where you talk about crisis driven by disruptive technologies. And I want to connect this with this TED talk that you gave few months ago that has millions of views all around the planet. And you talk about the balance of power globally, about the economic balance of power, the military balance of power, but then you have that special chapter on the technological balance of power. So we see disruptive technologies, but we also see now the impact of manipulated algorithms, the way that AI algorithms and social media can impact society. And you had this amazing phrase in the presentation where you basically say that inside democracies, and particularly the US democracy, many of these technologies were born and they are now becoming threats to our own concept of democracy. Why do you have such a worry, but you see it as an opportunity in those disruptive technologies? And what needs to occur in order not to lose the fundamentals of our democracy based on the greed that sometimes is behind this technology-driven economy of social media and algorithms with AI?
I do think that when I was a kid, when you were a kid, we were raised by our parents. We were in the schools. We knew the communities, the church, and that determined who we are, our genetic makeup, and the people around us that nurtured us. I think that today, increasingly, it's not just about nature and nurture; it's about algorithm. And young people today increasingly are becoming adults, being molded and intermediated by these algorithms on their smart devices that are becoming more and more powerful. They're not interested in creating good citizens. They're not interested in educating them to be well-rounded and well-developed citizens of the world. They're just interested in making sure that those kids spend as much time on those devices engaging and clicking as products. And that is a very good business for the companies, and it is disastrous for our kids, and it's disastrous for our democracy and for our civil society. So I'm very excited about AI. I think it's a technology that is going to make people around the world have access to world-class healthcare. It's going to reduce waste, improve efficiency in companies in every sector in the world, and it's going to do it explosively and quickly in ways that will drive globalization. As I said before, I'm very enthusiastic about AI. But in the same way that you and I benefited from industrialization with global growth, but nobody wanted to pay for the costs of dumping carbon in the atmosphere and destroying biodiversity, and those companies that made all the money from growth that we like were also responsible for the negative impact on the planet. We now have AI companies that are going to be responsible for incredible global growth, but they're also going to be responsible for destroying democracy and for hurting the health and well-being of our young people. And they have to be responsible for that. Now, when I look at the future of AI, I see a technology that is moving much faster than the governments are. And indeed, I think that in the next 5 years, the future of our society is likely to be more determined by the nature of the technology and the business models of the companies that happen to succeed in deploying it at scale than by what the governments do. And that's scary. And what that means is that the governments are not likely to be able to govern AI by themselves. They're going to have to create hybrid governance to work with the technology companies to do it together. And we see this already with climate change. The governments couldn't do it by themselves. They needed the young people. They needed the banks. They needed multi-stakeholder approach to ensure that we would invest enough at scale to get us out of oil and gas and coal. Well, you're going to have to do the same thing if we want to protect our democracies. It's not going to be enough to just say, oh, the governments are going to work on this. They won't do it fast enough. They'll need to deploy with the corporations and work together. And it will be uncomfortable. It will be uneasy. We're creating new architecture. The COP summits that you go to every year, the biodiversity summit that Colombia is hosting, you know, these are new institutions. We created them after we already had the crisis of climate change. We're going to have to build new hybrid institutions to respond to the crises that come from AI. And one of those crises will be the failure of our democracies.
Ian, I believe that, you know, that's so much on target that I want to connect that reflection, since we're running short of time, with some quick questions, because I totally agree. Ukraine and what's going to happen in what do you think is going to happen in the next months to come? Because Ukraine is related to democracy. Democracy will prevail. It's also related to new world technologies. Is related to information and communication wars that we're seeing on a permanent basis. And also it implies that the whole world governance system, not only the EU, but the United States, in some sort of way, the UN and other NATO, for example, they all have to look at this closely, because if what happens is not good in terms of weakening the Ukrainian system, the risks of further expansion of military investments and the tensions will be much higher. Give us an idea of where do you think this is going to be heading to?
Obviously, it's helpful that the U.S., after many months of dysfunction, were able to pass a bill that included $61 billion of military support for Ukraine, the largest single package the U.S. has provided. That's going to help the Ukrainians defend their front lines, get them the ammunition they need to keep the Russians from taking more of their land. But, you know, they're still running short of people. You know, they have a much smaller population, and it's hard for them to mobilize troops the way the Russians can. And it's also hard for them to defend their cities in terms of air defense. The U.S. is not going to keep giving $60 billion every year. Certainly not if Trump becomes president, maybe not even if Biden wins again. I'd say probably not. And so I think that the best scenario for Ukraine is that this additional money and support puts them in a better position to eventually negotiate with Russia, supported by the NATO and probably by the Chinese, but that Ukraine ends up partitioned. They lose their land. The 18% territory that Russia presently occupies, I doubt they're going to be able to take that back. I'm not happy about that. I don't think that's fair, but I think it's reality. I think the best scenario for Ukraine is that they will get security guarantees and a path to NATO for the rest of their territory. They'll have money to rebuild their country, and they can eventually join the EU. That is the best scenario. It is very possible that Ukraine is in a lot more trouble than that, and that the Russians continue to pound them, the Americans lose interest, and that Ukraine falls apart. The future of that world will be one where the Europeans understand that they need to prioritize their defense to a far greater degree. And you see a level of strategic autonomy driven by the French and the Poles and even the United Kingdom after a Labour government comes in later on this year. and the Germans may struggle with it. You'll have the Hungarians, the Italians a little bit more skeptical, but after overall, if the Russians are succeeding in winning the war in Ukraine, the Europeans will prioritize their defense like they have not in decades. And I think that will matter a lot. And NATO will not fall apart because Europe will be much stronger militarily. And Russia, even with the Iranians and with the North Koreans, ultimately, Russia is a rogue state. Russia does not have a strategic alliance with China. China wants a ceasefire. China needs stability in the world to do well. Russia does not. Russia wants chaos. Russia wants to take over Ukraine, and they want the failure of many other countries in the region. And they are actively deploying cyber attacks and espionage and attacks on critical infrastructure to undermine democracies that are already weak for reasons we've talked about across Europe and the United States. That's where I think Russia-Ukraine is going in the coming months. The Americans needed to take more seriously a year ago when the Ukrainians were doing better. They needed to use that better position, stronger position, to try to bring the Russians to the table. The Americans also needed to give a lot more to support to Ukraine in the earlier days, more military support, not hold off on the MiGs and the F-16s. Let the Polish government provide that support. They needed to do it. The initial response of the West should not have been, we'll take Zelensky out. Should not have been, Russia's going to take over in 2 weeks. I mean, the mistake the Americans made was not that they invited Ukraine into NATO, it's that they didn't invite Ukraine into NATO. You know, it was that they said, oh, yeah, we'll talk to you for decades, but we'll never make you a member. They either should have done nothing or they should have brought them into NATO. I mean, Putin's not interested in attacking Poland because he knows everyone's going to attack him back. But Ukraine, the revealed preference of the United States and the West is that Ukraine matters as much as Georgia. Ukraine matters almost as much as Chechnya. And that was the problem.
So I'm going to finish with two questions. This interview that has been fascinated with a little bit of U.S. elections connected to the crisis that we described. So we've talked about U.S.-China, we've talked about G0, we've talked about climate and disruptive technologies, and now Ukraine and Russia. So there's an upcoming election in November. It's going to be deeply polarized. We're going to see the whole world looking at this as not only as an interesting and necessary thing to observe, but also the way that this campaign will be handled will have impact, since there are a lot of copycats of the US electoral tactics and strategies. But let me say something. One of the great successes in foreign policy that I have seen, and I think Colombia is a great example, is when the foreign policy becomes state policy, and it is bipartisan, and it is bicameral. How do you think the way that we're going to deal with the crisis that are part of the book will change depending on the result on the election in November? And how can we avoid again another setback and maybe losing some of the things in which we have seen important advance?
Look, there's no easy answer to this because the U.S. is so divided right now, and divided in many ways on key foreign policy questions. I mean, on the Middle East, you know, the Obama administration did the Iranian nuclear deal. Trump pulled out of it. You know, Biden tried to get more money to the Iranians, tried to engage. Trump would be the exact opposite. He would put lots more sanctions on Iran. You know, I mean, it's very hard to have effective foreign policy when the most powerful country in the world is changing its foreign policy dramatically on the basis of every election. Trans-Pacific Partnership, Obama says he's going to do it, then he fails, then Trump ends it. Biden can't do a trade policy on this issue. I mean, you know, Paris Climate Accord, Trump pulls out, Biden says he's back in. You know, I can look at Russia, Ukraine. Biden says 61 billion, got to support it. Trump says I won't give another dollar to Ukraine if I come in. You know, I mean, it's very, very hard. But it's not all is not lost here. First of all, we've got bipartisan agreement that there needs to be a common policy on China, that there needs to be a strong level of military support and new architecture built for American allies in Asia. You see that with the Quad. You see that with AUKUS. You see that with the South Korea-Japan breakthrough that the Americans facilitated. You see that with the India relationship that is much, much stronger than it used to be. I think that will continue whether Trump or Biden wins. That's important. I also think that U.S. support for Israel will continue under Biden, under Trump. The Americans are isolated in that policy. It's not popular around the world at all, but it's going to be a consistent policy either way. And it's not one. And also the relatively strong relations between the U.S. and the Gulf states. I mean, I know that was a problem in terms of the Jamal Khashoggi assassination, but everyone's gotten through that. The Gulf countries are much more stable today than they were then. The Saudis are doing much better on the global stage. The Americans are fully prepared to engage. There's an effort to drive normalization between Saudi and Israel. Biden supports that. Trump would support that. If Trump wins, the good side of that is that the Republicans probably take all three houses. They probably end the filibuster. That makes it easier to get policy done that will include foreign policy in the House and Senate. So you have no filibuster. Some of that will be domestically contentious, but for foreign policy, you can get a migration bill done. You can actually address the border if there's no filibuster and one party controls the House, the Senate, and the executive. That looks likely if Trump wins. That's interesting. The Americans under Trump will beat up Mexico hard if they don't allow for more engagement of the U.S. military on migration, and if they don't put more resources into the southern border of Mexico. A new Mexican president will do that. They have no leverage versus the United States. If Trump hits them high, that'll work. On the other hand, Trump comes in, talks about 60% export tariffs on China. And if there's no filibuster, we could see an end of permanent normalized trade relations status between the U.S. and China. That'd be a disaster for the economy. U.S.-China would take a big hit, both sides, and a lot of allies would feel like they need to find a way to work more closely with China in that environment. Hedging would be harder to do on China if Trump wins the presidency. And on the Middle East, I think it could go either way. I mean, Trump would certainly hit Iranians hard. And when he was president, the Iranians backed down. When he was president, Hezbollah didn't have the money to pay salaries of their own people. That would be tough, but it's possible that some of these proxies, especially given the nature of the war in Gaza, they might engage in attacks even if the Iranian government didn't want them to. And also the Iranians are feeling more insecure because they've got an 84-year-old supreme leader who has probably advanced prostate cancer. The 300 missiles they launched against Israel surprised everybody, including the Israelis. It's possible that Trump decides to hit the Iranians hard and then we're in a much bigger war. So, I mean, there is a question to what extent you feel lucky if Trump wins. There's a lot more risk in the international environment from a Trump victory, a Trump presidency, even though there are some areas that I can see will have that he'll see some successes.
Well, let me also, I mean, it's so fascinating to see your responses, Ian, and they bring so many reflections to us. But let me finish with my last question. You look at Latin America quite oftenly. We've had a lot of meetings. I had the privilege of inviting you to talk with our cabinet in one of the planning sessions when I was in office. And you always help some of the countries identify in things that are not foreseeable easily. And it's like looking beyond the evidence. One message for Latin America. So I think about Latin America in multiple ways, but I think there's a reality that we saw at the end of 2023, and it was that for the first time in 20 years, Mexico ended up being the U.S. #1 trading partner, basically putting China in a second place for the first time in 20 years. We've seen great flows of investment, but Latin America is also a potential provider of clean energy, potential provider of food in an food insecurity global environment, at least forecasted due to the effects of climate change. But we also see LATAM as a place for new technologies to emerge, since we're having an expansion of the middle class. So there are many ways in which Latin America is related to the multiple crises that you mentioned in the book. is there any message that you want to share for Latin America in how the region should play in this G0 and this China-US climate and disruptive technologies crisis that we're facing?
Well, I mean, certainly you're right that Mexico has benefited significantly, both post-pandemic as well as given the challenges in the U.S.-China relationship at the high level. Though I would also say that a lot of that Mexico-U.S. trade relationship is Chinese investment into Mexico in companies that are then taking Chinese products and bringing them up to the United States. And so, I mean, you know, it's in a globalized economy, it's hard to parse that out. And that is something that the Chinese feel like they're doing very effectively, and an incoming Trump administration would focus on. So interesting to see how that relationship plays out. But look, I agree with you completely. There are a lot of ways that Latin America should be more integrated with the U.S. economy. The thing that I'm most concerned about is that I think that Latin America is deeply underinvesting in STEM education and in AI. Brazil doesn't really have an AI strategy. They're just starting to talk about an AI policy, but not really connected to what they're doing with industry. I said that the Americans are going to be dominant in terms of the major platforms, but the applications of small language models where the data sets are known and can be used for improving sectors, like to improve biodiversity, like to improve food production, like to improve tropical medicine. Like, these are areas that I want to see that there are already significant capabilities and knowledge in Latin American governments and countries. I want to see them using AI, deploying AI to make them world class and to be able to export those. And I don't see right now, you need to have you need to find out, like, who are the best, sort of Colombians, who are the best Brazilians that are working in Silicon Valley in AI, and they need to be part of your advisory teams on developing AI strategy. You need coalitions of those people, and you need them to be like representing you at Davos and Munich and at the big, like at the Hiroshima conference on AI and that the G7 is setting up, all those places. Latin America is way behind in those conversations right now. That needs to be picked up. You've got to be loud, you've got to be networking, you've got to be engaged, you've got to be working with the big companies.
Ian, you have left a lot of important elements to be discussed in our next panel, where we're going to discuss for the Spanish-speaking audience, El Poder de la Crisis, the Power of Crisis. Congratulations for the book. I have really enjoyed it. I read the English version. I enjoyed the Spanish version. I want to thank Planeta, the editorial, for making it accessible for the Spanish-speaking audience. We invite the people who are watching this webinar, but also the people that would watch it later, to buy the book, to be in the Bogota Book Fair, not only buying the book, but also with Foundation I+D sending questions and opening the debate. I really want to thank you for your generous time, for your friendship, and we really look forward to have you in Colombia soon. I have to really say it from the bottom of my heart, man, it's always fascinating to see how you allow us to open our eyes, and some of your jaw-dropping effects when you analyze many of the global trends. And Ian, we really look forward for your next book. I don't know when it's coming, but we hope that maybe in the next book, some of the conversations that are going to be triggered in Latin America can be part of it. You're very much respected in our region, and I want to thank you for being with us this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend. It's always a pleasure and a privilege. I'm really delighted that we were able to do this today, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in person soon.
We'll see you soon. All the best, Ian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Bremmer. I believe we lost Mr. Bremmer. He went off. We had some questions probably, but we had the chance to talk to him later because we think he is now off. Is that true? We don't have him anymore?
No, we don't have it anymore.
Okay, Mr. President. Thank you for that enlightened conversation. Very inspiring. I think we're thinking and rethinking many of the things happening in our world today. And thank you for this opportunity. Great interview, Mr. President.
Well, that's I don't know if this is the starting of my journalistic career, but I will certainly say goodbye and leave you in the conversation with our panelists. Agradecerles a todos ustedes de verdad por habernos acompañado esta mañana y ahora queremos escucharlos a ustedes. Yo ya me desconecto y dejo que nuestros panelistas, con toda la autoridad y el conocimiento que tienen, pues puedan abordar esta conversación. Estaré ya siguiéndola sin estar en cámara y agradecerle a Pablo Navas, el rector de la Universidad de los Andes, agradecerle también a Andrés Molano, a Jessica, a Andrés y por supuesto a nuestra increíble moderadora Andrea Bernal. Les mando un saludo muy especial y espero que con todo lo que dijo Ian de tantos temas podamos tener también una conversación nutrida analizando este maravilloso libro, El poder de la crisis.
Presidente, mil gracias.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Gracias a todos. Quizás
Gusto de verlo, presidente.
una conversación o una conclusión corta, un comentario muy corto. Y me gustaría tal vez empezar por Jessica Fayeta, que estaba muy interesada, como todos, en esta conversación con el presidente y el señor Bremmer. Jessica, muy corto, pero que nos dé unos puntos de lo que tú sacas del libro que estamos hablando hoy, del señor Bremmer. Bienvenida.
Bueno, un gusto estar de nuevo, Andrea, qué gusto verte y pues compartir con Andrés, con Pablo y por supuesto con oírle de viva voz al autor. Mira, este libro, a pesar de que habla de crisis y las crisis muy profundas, en el fondo es un libro que yo lo encontré positivo porque él pone mucha fe en la humanidad. Dice que, bueno, al final del día, cuando ya la crisis va a ser la más grande de todas o la peor crisis, la humanidad va a poder colaborar y va a ponerse junto. Y en eso se basa con varios ejemplos alrededor de los últimos dos siglos. También lo encontré bastante pragmático y realista porque él dice que, bueno, esta colaboración, sobre todo una colaboración internacional que es muy necesaria, no tiene que ser colaboración en todo, ni tienen que ser todos a la vez colaborando, ni tiene tampoco que ser sobre todos los problemas, pero sí con algunos específicos, algunos países que quieran venir juntos a resolver y que, por supuesto, hagan una masa crítica de poder resolverlos y al mismo tiempo que se pueda ir avanzando. Y en eso pues le pone una fe al multilateralismo, diría yo que vengo de 30 años de ser funcionaria de la ONU, pues eso para mí ha sido refrescante, pero al mismo tiempo un multilateralismo limitado por un lado, pero también reformado, actualizado a lo que realmente, como está el mundo, y reconoce que dentro de eso, pues las divisiones son las divisiones en el que el mundo en que estamos, que cada vez las vemos más, pues de todas maneras es posible llegar a algunos acuerdos. Y para mí eso ha sido muy, muy importante como multilateralista que me considero, de ver realmente de ver que una crisis puede ser el detonante para que también el multilateralismo se reforme, se refuerce, pero al mismo tiempo sea más realista y pragmático de lo que hemos tenido ahora en estos momentos. Esto diría yo de mi parte.
Jessica, mil gracias. Me encantaría escuchar a Andrés Molano, que también nos está acompañando a esta hora con una corta reflexión. Andrés, bienvenido.
Gracias, Andrea. Un saludo para todos y gracias a la Fundación I+D por esta oportunidad. A mí me queda resonando un término que empleó Ian Bremmer en su presentación, que es el de instituciones híbridas. Y quisiera conectar esto un poco con lo que ya ha mencionado Jessica. La gobernanza global hoy en día es un asunto demasiado serio para dejarlo solamente en manos de los estados y necesitamos encontrar nuevos diseños institucionales, aprovechar lecciones aprendidas para encontrar instrumentos que involucren a actores del sector privado, las grandes corporaciones. Si pensamos en temas como la inteligencia artificial en el marco de ese mundo tecnopolar, que es otro término que ha acuñado Ian Bremmer recientemente, no podemos pensar en la gobernanza de la inteligencia artificial sin la participación del sector privado. En Múnich, en la conferencia de este año, precisamente más de 20 grandes tecnológicas dedicadas a la inteligencia artificial concluyeron un acuerdo de autorregulación unos compromisos de esfuerzos unilaterales del sector privado para proteger los procesos electorales frente a la influencia nociva del uso de algunas tecnologías de inteligencia artificial. Creo que apostar por el polilateralismo más allá del multilateralismo tradicional, buscar esas instituciones híbridas, incorporar al sector privado, a la sociedad civil a través de centros de pensamiento, de organizaciones cívicas, puede darle nueva fuerza a ese multilateralismo, pero además permitirnos aprovechar el poder de la crisis, involucrando cada vez más actores cada vez más necesarios. Muchas gracias.
A ti, Andrés, por esa reflexión tan interesante. Veo también aquí a Andrés Rugeles, que nos acompaña. Me encantaría también escucharlo con una reflexión de esta casi hora que hemos escuchado con el presidente Duque al señor Ian Bremmer. Andrés, ¿cómo estás?
¿Cómo estás, Andrea? Un gusto saludarlos a todos y yo dejaría tres mensajes principales. Yo empezaría diciendo el tono del libro es muy importante porque es un tono optimista, es ver el vaso medio lleno. Y ante estas crisis siempre hay que tener esa actitud propositiva, una actitud positiva y ver de cómo se puede superar estas crisis globales. Ahora, hay lecciones, cuando uno ve el COVID-19, hay una lección que dejó muy grande y es el mundo necesita una mayor cooperación y una mayor solidaridad en el marco multilateralismo renovado. Lamentablemente, lo que vimos con COVID-19 no fue eso. Vimos más que todo tensiones nacionalistas, vimos cómo las vacunas se convirtieron en instrumentos de protección nacional en vez de cooperación global, como deberían ser. Luego, acá hay un llamado importante es cómo el mundo, ante estos nuevos retos, va a poder fortalecer estos esquemas de cooperación y solidaridad. Ya hay algunos que dicen en el tema específico, por ejemplo, de los de salud, que debamos tener un cuerpo de emergencias sanitarias globales, es decir, un gran departamento de bomberos para las pandemias, pero eso no está ocurriendo hoy. Y esto es un llamado de atención a nivel global, debemos encaminar estos esfuerzos hacia el futuro. Un segundo comentario es, Ian Bremmer menciona tres crisis: salud, cambio climático y tecnología. Yo le agregaría una cuarta, y es democracia. Cuando vemos el estado de democracia a nivel global, vemos que hay un retroceso muy importante. Ojo, no solo en América Latina, sino a nivel global. Vemos la emergencia de gobiernos cada vez más autocráticos, populistas, y acá hay un llamado a repensar la democracia a nivel global y los instrumentos de protección de la democracia a nivel hemisférico e internacional. Y un cuarto punto, o tercer punto, es cómo llega América Latina ante estas triple crisis. Y acá hay un gran interrogante, es ¿qué va a hacer América Latina frente al fortalecimiento de sus temas de salud, frente a los rezagos de tecnología que tiene hoy, que Ian Bremmer lo mencionó muy claramente, y cómo aprovechamos las ventajas que tenemos hoy en materia de medio ambiente, diversidad, para hacer una contribución efectiva a nivel mundial? Son preguntas que hay que pensarlas muy seriamente, pero más que preguntas, es un llamado a la acción de los líderes de América Latina y a tomarse en serio el futuro de la región.
Gracias, Andrés. Pues nos dejan pensando y repensando muchas cosas el día de hoy. Buena manera de terminar una semana, de empezar un viernes. Y gracias a todos, gracias a la Fundación Innovación para el Desarrollo por esta oportunidad de haber escuchado a Ian Bremmer hoy con su libro, que pues ahora sale en español y una opción para todos en América Latina. A todos, mil gracias. Ha sido un gusto y que tengan un excelente resto de día y buen fin de semana.